American farmers are bracing for some big changes under President Trump's new immigration policy. John Deere is going to be paying a 200% tariff. They haven't started it yet. Maybe they haven't even made the final decision yet. To Wall Street, Deere's Investor Day is underway, and the CEO is out with a kind of dire warning about the state of farming right now. In the wake of Donald Trump's election as President of the United States, the farming industry found itself standing at a pivotal crossroad. With the stroke of a pen, a new chapter began, one dominated by economic nationalism and protectionist policies. Among the first bold moves made by President Trump was the announcement of a series of tariffs aimed squarely at America's largest trade partners. The intention was to reassert America's control over its own industrial destiny, particularly in manufacturing. However, for the farming sector, a cornerstone of American exports, these measures signaled the beginning of a period of serious turbulence. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. At the heart of this rising storm stood John May, CEO of John Deere, one of the most iconic companies in the agricultural equipment sector. As a leader intimately connected to both the technology that powers American farms and the farmers who operate that machinery, May's position gave him a unique vantage point. When he revealed the growing concerns affecting the farming industry, he did so not just as a corporate figure, but as a spokesperson for a sector that was bracing itself against a new and potentially destabilizing era. The tariff strategy pursued by the Trump administration was broad and aggressive. Tariffs were imposed on steel and aluminum imports, impacting a wide array of industries. But the farming sector felt the pressure most acutely when retaliatory tariffs came into play. Countries that had long relied on American crops, China, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union among them, responded by slapping their own tariffs on American agricultural exports. Soybeans, corn, pork, dairy, and other U.S.-grown products suddenly became more expensive in key foreign markets. This development caused a cascade of consequences, both immediate and long-term, across the agricultural heartlands of the country. The United States had historically enjoyed strong agricultural trade relationships. American farmers were accustomed to growing high volumes of crops with the assurance that overseas markets would absorb much of the yield. But the moment tariffs began to reshape global trade dynamics, that confidence eroded. Export volumes declined, and prices followed. In markets where American produce once reigned, buyers turned to alternative suppliers in countries unaffected by the tariff war. Nations like Brazil and Argentina quickly became the new go-to suppliers for soybeans and other crops, seizing the opportunity left in the wake of diminished U.S. trade. For the American farmer, the shift was more than just economic. It was existential. The costs of farming are high and fixed: equipment, fuel, seed, labor, insurance. Farmers plan their seasons months in advance, guided by weather predictions, crop rotation strategies, and global demand forecasts. The unpredictability introduced by tariffs undermined this careful calculus. Suddenly, farmers were forced to navigate not only the caprices of nature, but also the whims of geopolitics. And the impact wasn't isolated, it was generational. Many family farms operate on thin margins and are handed down from parents to children. With profits shrinking and market access shrinking even faster, the viability of maintaining those legacies came under direct threat. John Deere, as a manufacturer of advanced farming machinery, found itself entangled in the same web. The company doesn't just sell tractors and harvesters, it sells technology and efficiency to farmers who need to maximize output while minimizing waste. But with commodity prices falling and international demand waning, many farmers began postponing equipment upgrades. New purchases were delayed, financing became tighter, and the used equipment market surged as farmers sought to stretch the life of existing machines. This slowdown in capital investment reverberated throughout the agricultural supply chain, with dealerships, part suppliers, and maintenance service providers all feeling the pinch. In revealing these growing challenges, John May emphasized how deeply the industry was being affected, not just in terms of economics, but in its very spirit. There was a palpable anxiety rippling through rural America. Farming communities that had voted in large numbers for Trump out of a belief in revitalized American strength were now watching their livelihoods hang in the balance. Towns built around agriculture, where John Deere green was as common as the soil itself, found themselves grappling with a new kind of uncertainty, one born not from drought, flooding door pests, but from a volatile and shrinking global marketplace. As prices dipped below break-even points, farmers faced difficult decisions. Do they plant at a loss, hoping for better prices down the line? Do they scale back operations and risk losing their competitive edge? Some chose to exit the industry altogether, unable to withstand the mounting financial pressure. Others turned to government aid programs, though these came with bureaucratic hurdles and were often viewed as unsustainable stopgaps. Meanwhile, John Deere saw its order books shrink, its forecasts darken, and its workforce brace for potential impacts. One of the less visible, but no less significant consequences of the tariff crisis was the stifling of innovation in the sector. The farming industry had been undergoing a slow but steady technological revolution, with precision agriculture, GPS-guided machinery, and data-driven crop management, promising to increase productivity and sustainability. But innovation requires investment. With revenues declining and confidence shaken, many farmers halted their transition to newer, smarter systems. This not only hurt manufacturers like John Deere, but also slowed the overall progress of American agriculture, allowing international competitors to potentially leap ahead in the global race for farming efficiency. The uncertainty also began to distort planning cycles. Normally, farmers would work in tandem with equipment makers to plan purchases and upgrades ahead of planting and harvesting seasons. But now, decisions were delayed, financing partners grew more cautious, and predictions became guesswork. This ripple effect reached even into academia and research institutions focused on agriculture. Funding for research into crop resilience, soil science, and farming sustainability began to face scrutiny as priorities shifted toward immediate economic survival. Across the Midwest and the Great Plains, regions that are emblematic of American agricultural strength, the mood was one of cautious endurance. There was still pride in the land and in the work, but it was now tempered by a sharper awareness of how interconnected the world economy had become. The idea that America could unilaterally impose economic boundaries without consequences proved dangerously naive. Global agriculture is a web of relationships, finely balanced and decades in the making. Disrupting that balance risked not just temporary losses, but a long-term erosion of market share, trust, and influence. It's within this context that John May's voice carried particular weight. He was not only relaying data from his company's balance sheets, he was amplifying the unease of countless farmers who saw the foundations of their industry shaking. Deere's insight came from having a foot in both worlds, the corporate one that watched stock tickers and shareholder value, and the practical one that measured success in bushels, acres, and seasons. That dual perspective made Deere's revelations all the more compelling. They weren't mere corporate complaints. They were a signal flare from a vital sector caught in a geopolitical crossfire. As the tariffs tightened, the future of American farming hung in the balance. Here is the text with commas and full stops added for clarity and proper punctuation. As their grip tightened, another subtle but serious impact began to emerge: the weakening of America's agricultural diplomacy. For decades, food exports had been a source of both economic strength and soft power for the U.S. The reliability, safety, and quality of American agricultural products had opened doors and built relationships across continents. But now, countries once reliant on U.S. goods were building new supply chains and forming new trade alliances. Some of these changes would not be easily reversed. Once a market shifts suppliers, especially in agriculture, it often doesn't come back. Trust is hard-earned and easily lost. In addition, the perception of the U.S. as a stable and predictable trading partner took a hit. Buyers prefer consistency, especially when dealing with perishable goods and multi-year supply contracts. The unpredictable policy shifts and trade threats made the U.S. a riskier bet. Countries that once competed for American crops began to hedge their bets, signing long-term agreements with other producers. Meanwhile, American farmers watched as years of careful relationship building unraveled in a matter of months. Another dimension to the problem was the sheer scale of American agriculture. The U.S. produces far more than it consumes domestically, meaning that exports are not a luxury. They are a necessity. Unlike some industries that can pivot inward during tough times, farming is built on the logic of global reach. Without access to foreign markets, the volume of surplus becomes a liability, driving down prices and mastic markets. Storage becomes a logistical nightmare, and product deterioration adds another layer of cost. This creates a vicious cycle. Fewer buyers mean lower prices, which means less revenue and fewer investments in the next cycle. Labor was another factor caught in the crosshairs. The farming industry relies heavily on seasonal and immigrant labor, much of which was already under pressure from shifting immigration policies. The added economic stress from trade tariffs compounded the issue, making it harder for farms to operate at capacity. Some crops were left unharvested due to labor shortages, and others were sold at a loss just to clear space for the next planting cycle. The fragility of the entire ecosystem, from planting to harvesting to exporting, was laid bare. Throughout this period, the tone from John Deere's leadership remained one of concern, not confrontation. They sought to illuminate the risks rather than escalate the rhetoric. But the message was clear. The farming sector was being asked to bear the brunt of a geopolitical gamble, and the costs were mounting quickly. Unlike other sectors, which could retool or pivot in response to tariffs, agriculture moves with the seasons and the soil. It cannot simply be recalibrated overnight. What became clear through John May's statements and the data emerging from the heartland was that this wasn't a temporary blip. The consequences of these trade decisions had the potential to reshape the agricultural landscape for years to come. Market share lost might not return. Technological momentum slowed might never fully recover. And a generation of farmers might find itself asking whether the risks of the profession were still worth the reward. As American agriculture struggled to find its footing amidst shifting global trade winds, the revelations made by John Deere's leadership stood as a sobering reminder of how deeply interconnected the global economy had become, and how fragile that interconnection could be when tested by policy decisions made without a full appreciation for their ripple effects. The farming industry, often viewed through a nostalgic lens of self-reliance and rugged independence, was now a frontline casualty in a much larger and more complex economic conflict. And as the fields awaited the next planting season, uncertainty hung in the air like a cloud refusing to break. Would the markets recover? Would international buyers return? Would farmers regain the confidence to invest in their futures? Those answers remained uncertain. But one truth had been laid bare. When the lifelines of global trade are strained, it is often the people closest to the land who feel the first and most lasting impacts. The farming industry, deeply woven into the economic and cultural fabric of the United States, found itself immersed in an evolving storm, a storm that came not from the sky, but from within the very architecture of international trade. The announcement of sweeping tariffs by the newly elected President Donald Trump shifted the terrain beneath the feet of American farmers, forcing a recalibration of assumptions that had guided agricultural production and export for decades. What followed was not only a challenge to the balance sheets of individual farmers, but also a fundamental test of the resilience and structure of American agribusiness as a whole. The tariffs were not isolated adjustments. They represented a shift in the broader philosophy governing American engagement with global markets. These policies aimed to encourage domestic production and reduce trade deficits by taxing imported goods. While this approach was designed to protect certain industries, agriculture, a sector heavily reliant on global demand, became collateral damage. Unlike steel or machinery manufacturing, agricultural commodities are perishable, seasonal, and highly sensitive to fluctuations in global pricing and demand. Farmers cannot simply store years of harvests in warehouses while waiting for trade tensions to ease. The market must be available and accessible when the crops are ready. The farming ecosystem in the U.S. is uniquely expansive. It includes not just farms and ranches, but also grain elevators, railways, river barges, ports, seed companies, input manufacturers, equipment makers, and software developers. Tariffs disrupted this finely tuned system at every point. For example, decreased exports led to lower throughput at grain elevators, which in turn reduced demand for rail and barge transportation. This underutilization had a knock-on effect on logistics companies and port facilities, where entire shipping lanes geared toward agricultural exports began to slow or idle. Within the insurance and finance segments, the implications were equally significant. Farming loans, often extended with the expectation of a return following harvest and export, began to carry increased risk. Banks and agricultural lenders had to reconsider the stability of their agricultural portfolios, especially in regions heavily dependent on trade-sensitive crops like soybeans and sorghum. Some lending institutions tightened their requirements, increased interest rates, or reduced the volume of credit available to small and mid-sized farmers. These shifts added a further burden to farmers already coping with lower revenues and reduced international demand. Meanwhile, cooperative systems, agricultural cooperatives formed to help small-scale producers share equipment, storage, and distribution, began to feel the pressure. These co-ops rely on scale to function efficiently. But when tariffs triggered a drop in exports, many co-ops saw their member participation drop. Fewer members meant fewer contributions to shared infrastructure and services, threatening the very viability of these support systems. In some communities, co-ops that had been operating for generations were forced to consolidate or shutter, leaving their members exposed to higher individual operating costs. In the technology sphere, the blowback was subtler, but equally worrisome. The rise of app-tech software, drones, AI-powered soil sensors, and data platforms designed to improve farming efficiency depended on a growing and financially healthy user base. With farm incomes declining, subscriptions to precision agriculture services dropped, pilot programs were postponed, and venture capital interest began to wane. Startups that had hoped to revolutionize farming by offering data insights on crop health, weather prediction, and market analytics found themselves struggling to find clients. The progress of digitizing American farms began to stall, hampering not just growth, but also the ability to compete with other nations making faster technological strides. Educational institutions and land-grant universities, long at the forefront of agricultural research and extension services, also felt the indirect effects of the tariff-induced downturn. These universities partner with local farmers, run test plots, and develop region-specific recommendations for crop management. As budgets were squeezed and grant funding dried up, partly because of declining contributions from strained private sector partners, the pipeline of innovation and education weakened. The reduced collaboration between researchers and farmers meant fewer new techniques and best practices reached the fields, further stalling progress and innovation. Within the geopolitical arena, American agricultural dominance began to look less assured. Countries previously dependent on U.S. grain, livestock, and dairy products began to diversify their supply chains with urgency. In regions such as Southeast Asia and the Middle East, importers sought out new partnerships with producers in Eastern Europe, Australia, and South America. This pivot wasn't just about price, it was about reliability. The perception that U.S. trade policy could shift rapidly and without warning made importers wary of future disruptions. Once those new trade routes were established, they became entrenched, making it difficult for the U.S. to regain lost ground. Domestically, regional differences in crop types led to uneven economic fallout. For instance, soybean growers in the Midwest were among the hardest hit due to China's retaliatory tariffs, which directly targeted U.S. soybeans. Cotton farmers in the South, who had also seen increasing demand from international buyers prior to the tariffs, suddenly saw that growth curtailed. Meanwhile, the dairy industry in states like Wisconsin and New York suffered as exports to Canada, and the EU fell under similar retaliatory measures. This regional impact deepened the sense of vulnerability in farming communities and fueled growing concerns about whether Washington truly understood the agricultural sector's complexities. At a cultural level, there was a growing sense of alienation. Farming communities, already coping with long-standing challenges such as population decline, school closures, and limited access to health care, saw the trade war as yet another blow from a distant political system disconnected from rural realities. Conversations around kitchen tables and community centers increasingly revolved around survival strategies, not growth opportunities. Mental health crises, already on the rise in rural America, were exacerbated by the added stress of economic uncertainty. The emotional toll was visible, particularly among multi-generational farmers who felt they might be the last in their family to work the land. From a business perspective, John Deere found itself navigating a volatile and shrinking market. The company, which typically tailored its production schedules to cyclical purchasing patterns among farmers, faced greater unpredictability. Inventories began to swell, leading to increased storage and holding costs. The international side of Deere's operations also faced complications as tariffs on imported steel and aluminum increased the cost of production. These rising input costs could not be fully passed on to customers already struggling with low commodity prices, so the company was forced to absorb some of the losses. In response, John Deere initiated internal cost-saving measures. While these did not always include layoffs, they did mean delaying expansion projects, limiting research budgets, and postponing certain product releases. This defensive strategy, while fiscally responsible, also meant that the company's growth trajectory slowed at a time when innovation was critical. The push toward autonomous machinery, AI-integrated systems, and eco-friendly farming tools was still ongoing, but at a pace constrained by economic caution. There was also a growing divergence between large-scale agribusiness operations and small to mid-sized family farms. While some large firms had the capital reserves and global reach to weather the volatility, sometimes by shifting operations abroad or diversifying revenue streams, smaller farms were left with fewer options. The structural imbalance grew more pronounced. Large agribusiness conglomerates began buying out distressed properties, further consolidating the industry and reducing the overall diversity of the farming landscape. The rise in farm bankruptcies during this period was not just a numerical trend. It was a transformation of ownership patterns across rural America. Each bankruptcy often meant the end of a legacy, the closure of a farm passed down through generations. With each loss, the character of rural communities shifted. Schools closed due to shrinking populations. Farm supply stores and local diners lost their regular patrons. The economic decline bred a kind of social erosion that extended far beyond spreadsheets and crop reports. Supply chains for critical inputs, fertilizer, seed, fuel, also began to feel the reverberations of the tariffs. While some of these materials were produced domestically, many relied on imported components or raw materials. Tariffs imposed on chemical ingredients or machinery parts pushed costs upward, narrowing already thin profit margins. Some farmers reported having to switch to lower-quality inputs or change planting strategies mid-season based on what they could afford, rather than what would be most productive. These improvisations, while necessary, further reduced output, and made American agriculture less competitive. Environmental initiatives also suffered as farmers faced economic headwinds. They found it increasingly difficult to invest in conservation measures or sustainable practices. Programs that had encouraged cover cropping, reduced tillage, and precision fertilization became luxuries rather than necessities. This had downstream effects on soil health, water quality, and carbon emissions. The long-term sustainability of U.S. agriculture was being traded for short-term economic survival, an exchange that could have lasting ecological consequences. Even sectors not directly tied to exports began to feel the stress. Livestock producers, for instance, often rely on grain prices as a key input in feed. As grain markets collapsed, price imbalances rippled through the entire animal agriculture chain. Additionally, with meat exports declining, domestic markets were flooded, driving prices down. The result was a surplus of product and a shortage of profits. Processing facilities, distribution centers, and cold storage networks were tested to their limits. Legal disputes also began to rise. Some farming cooperatives and commodity boards sought relief or exemptions from specific tariffs, filing complaints through official trade channels or lobbying Congress for legislative adjustments. Trade associations became more vocal, organizing forums and white papers to quantify the damage. While these efforts brought attention to the crisis, they did little to reverse its course. Policymakers were often caught between ideological commitment to tariffs and the practical reality of widespread agricultural distress. The fallout also began to shift political alliances. Many rural voters who had strongly supported Trump began to voice frustration, if not outright dissent. Local officials, governors, and agricultural commissioners from both parties started advocating more aggressively for federal intervention, including more robust subsidies or tariff rollbacks. However, these conversations often stalled amid broader political gridlock, leaving farming communities in limbo. Insurance payouts and federal aid programs intended to act as buffers were sometimes slow to arrive or insufficient in scale. The Market Facilitation Program, MFP, introduced as a form of tariff relief for farmers, was criticized for uneven distribution and for favoring large producers. Some farmers received only marginal support, far less than what they needed to offset their losses. The bureaucratic inefficiencies added another layer of frustration to an already dire situation. John Deere's internal communications with stakeholders became increasingly cautious. Invest in I. Briefings highlighted the unpredictability of demand, especially in North America. The company's international operations, while offering some revenue insulation, were not enough to offset the turbulence at home. Strategic planning became a game of scenario modeling. What if tariffs intensified? What if retaliation spread to more product categories? What if foreign competitors outpaced U.S. machinery sales? As all of these factors unfolded, one theme remained constant: the entire agricultural model of the United States, its economic assumptions, operational rhythms, technological evolution, and international relationships, had been jolted by a single policy shift. The depth and breadth of the impact extended far beyond initial expectations. Farming, long seen as a stable, if challenging career, had become a field of uncertainty, exposed to forces well beyond the weather or the markets. What emerged was a growing consensus across the industry. American agriculture cannot thrive in isolation. The global marketplace is not merely a competitive arena, it is a cooperative web. When that web is disturbed, it's not just balance sheets that suffer, but the very structure of rural life. Farmers, equipment manufacturers, researchers, financiers, educators, and policy experts all operate within a shared ecosystem that depends on trust, predictability, and long-term planning. The period that followed President Trump's tariff announcements marked a turning point. It was a moment when American agriculture had to confront its vulnerabilities, reassess its assumptions, and adapt to a rapidly changing world. The pain was real, the consequences lasting, and the lessons, while hard-earned, became etched into the industry's collective memory. As the United States agricultural sector continued to reel from the consequences of the Trump administration's trade policies, particularly the introduction of broad tariffs on key global partners, the downstream effects grew even more intricate and deeply rooted. While earlier phases of the crisis centered on falling export volumes, market instability, and the emotional toll on farmers, the long-term structural vulnerabilities of the American agricultural system began to emerge in sharper relief. One of the most significant yet underappreciated impacts of the tariffs was the fragmentation of the global supply chain surrounding American agriculture. For decades, U.S. farmers benefited from a networked infrastructure that not only moved goods efficiently across the country, but also ensured seamless handoffs to international buyers through strategically developed port and logistics systems. The stability of this chain depended on high throughput and uninterrupted movement. Once tariffs disrupted international demand, the ripple effect struck transportation, warehousing, and shipping services with full force. Companies specializing in intermodal freight, trucking firms, rail operators, and cargo lines found themselves grappling with underutilized capacity. Empty rail cars and idle trucks became a more common sight, particularly in states like Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, where grain and livestock exports had sharply declined. This decrease in volume forced many logistics operators to raise their rates to maintain margins, ironically increasing domestic shipping costs for the very farmers already facing lower international prices. With fewer exports and higher internal distribution costs, profitability suffered on both ends of the spectrum. Export bottlenecks also emerged. Ports that had heavily invested in agricultural shipping infrastructure, facilities equipped with grain elevators, cold storage for perishables, and rapid loading equipment, found themselves underused. These ports were built to handle high-volume international demand, especially from Asia and Europe, and their business models did not accommodate such dramatic fluctuations in usage. Maintenance of such high-capacity infrastructure without corresponding throughput became financially burdensome, forcing many ports to reduce staff or delay expansion projects meant to improve competitiveness. Another overlooked area affected by the tariffs was agricultural education, particularly in vocational and community college settings. These institutions train a workforce that supports farming in everything from diesel mechanics, for tractors, to agribusiness management and animal nutrition. As rural economies faltered, so too did enrollment in agricultural programs. Students who might have pursued careers in these essential roles began to question the future stability of such employment. Declining student numbers led to program cuts and, in some cases, closures. This educational erosion threatened to create a skills gap, where even if the market rebounded, there would be a shortage of trained professionals ready to support it. Beyond education, rural infrastructure investment stalled as tax revenues from agricultural production and property. Assessments began to dry up. Rural counties depend on farm-generated economic activity for a large share of their local budgets. Property taxes from landowners, income taxes from workers, and business taxes from farm-adjacent services are all crucial to maintaining schools, roads, emergency services, and broadband initiatives. As profits disappeared, these vital services came under strain. Counties had to make difficult decisions. Some postponed road maintenance projects, others reduced funding for rural health clinics. This degradation in public infrastructure added another burden to the lives of already stressed farming families. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us what your thoughts are on John Deere's CEO revealing farming issues after Trump's tariffs. We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.